The summer of 2025 had been cruel to the valley for weeks. The forest air hung heavy with the tang of smoke, and each sunset bled the sky into an angry red that made even the rivers look like molten glass. The fire had started far from town, a lightning strike in late July, but by August it had eaten miles of pine and cedar like paper. Whole hillsides fell into themselves, their roots turned to embers beneath the soil. The old logging roads, long forgotten by maps, were suddenly visible again, charred black lines running through the forest like scars no one remembered having. On the third day after the fire was declared, contained a team of exhausted firefighters pushed through a section of scorched undergrowth near mile marker 47 on the interstate. They weren't looking for anything in particular. They were clearing hotspots, stamping out the last stubborn flames in case the wind decided to turn traitor. It was one of them, a young crewman named Ellis, who spotted the glint, just a sliver of metal. At first, peeking from beneath a tangle of burned saplings, he thought it might be a guardrail warped by heat. But as he stepped closer, it became something else, something bigger. The sun caught on it again, not silver, but the dulled yellow of paint long weathered into rust. It took them 30 minutes to cut a path through, and there, hunched between the blackened tree trunks, stood the skeleton of a bus. It shouldn't have been there. No road led to it. The ground around it was uneven and choked with the twisted roots of trees that had taken decades to grow. The bus was tilted slightly to the right as if it had been frozen mid-turn. Its windshield was gone, eaten away by time, and whether the number 6 was still visible above the front, though the edges of the paint had curled in on themselves like burnt paper. Someone radioed it in. Within an hour, the forest was no longer quiet. Engines growled at the perimeter. Men in yellow jackets stood beside men in dark uniforms. Crime scene tape fluttered between stumps, still warm from the fire. The smell of ash mixed with the faint, oily tang of rusted metal inside the bus. The air was stale and close. The seats were still bolted in place, though most of their vinyl had cracked into curling strips. Dust lay thick on everything, softening sharp edges, muting colors, as if time had been afraid to move too quickly here. One firefighter whispered that it looked like the fire had revealed something it shouldn't have, like the forest had been hiding it on purpose. By the time the first photographs hit the evening news, most people in town assumed it was just another casualty of the fire, an abandoned vehicle left behind by hunters or squatters. But in a small second-story apartment on the edge of the old downtown, an elderly woman sat staring at the screen. Her name was Eleanor March. Her hands shook as she turned the volume up. She leaned forward until her face was inches from the glass, her reflection trembling in the flickering light. The bus was yellow, number 6. Even after 30 years, she knew it the way a mother knows the sound of her child's voice in a crowd. The newscaster was still mid-sentence when Eleanor's teacup slipped from her grip and shattered against the kitchen tile. She barely heard the crash. Her breath came thin, sharp. Her fingers curled around the armrest, as if bracing for a sudden fall. They found them, she whispered to no one but the walls. Her voice was so soft it might have been mistaken for the wind from here. The narrative would cut to section 2, flashing back to 1995, the day the bus didn't return. The contrast between the ash-covered present and the warm autumnal past would deepen the emotional weight, making the mystery even sharper. October 3rd, 1995 began without fanfare. The air in Alder Creek was crisp, the kind of early autumn chill that bit gently at the ears but spared the fingertips. The leaves had just begun their slow surrender, the maples bleeding into gold and crimson, the birches paling into ghost white. By 7 a.m., the little town was awake. The bakery on Main Street had pulled its first trays of bread from the oven, filling the air with the heavy warmth of yeast. Gas station coffee steamed in paper cups balanced on dashboards as trucks rumbled out toward the mills on the corner by Alder Creek. Elementary children with oversized backpacks shuffled their feet, breath puffing in small clouds, while they waited for the bus. The bus, number 6, came rattling around the bend at 714 sharp, its worn yellow paint still bright enough to catch the morning light. Daniel Rourke, the driver, gave his usual nod from behind the wide flat. Well, he was a quiet man in his late 40s, his hair thinning, but his routine reliable too. The minute today was special. This wasn't the morning route to school. It was a trip out to Gray Hollow Nature Reserve, an hour north through the winding hills. 9 students, all between the ages of 9 and 11, had been selected for the district's first wilderness class, a pilot program meant to teach survival skills, ecology, and environmental citizenship. As the flyers had put it, parents had been given permission slips and assurances. 2 teachers chaperoning the driver vetted the trip, supervised From start to finish for the 9 children, it was an adventure. They climbed aboard with chatter and backpack zippers, and the smell of packed lunches wrapped in foil. Someone had brought a Polaroid camera. Someone else had a bright red thermos they'd gotten for their birthday. The youngest of the group, Amelia Ortega, carried a stuffed fox in her lap, a gift from her grandmother. She refused to leave at home. The bus pulled away at 723. Mrs. Lang, one of the chaperones, waved from the steps as they rounded the corner and disappeared down the Tulane Highway. It was the last time anyone in Alder Creek would see bus number 6. On the road, the day passed without incident in town. Parents went to work. The mill's lunch whistle blew at noon. At 3, the high school football team began practice under the long shadows of the field lights. It wasn't until nearly 6 o'clock that the first thread in the routine began to unravel. A mother, Carol Miller, stood outside her house glancing at her watch. The trip had been scheduled to return by 5:30. Shed made spaghetti for dinner, and the sauce had been simmering since mid-afternoon. By 6:10, the food had gone cold. By 6:30, Shed called the school. The secretary's voice was calm, but clipped. "They're probably just delayed, Carol. Cell service is spotty up near Gray Hollow. I'm sure they're fine." Carol hung up, but unease had already begun to spread through her chest like ink and water. She called 2 other parents. They had the same answers. No, their kids weren't home yet. Yes, they'd tried the school. No, nothing. By 700, the principal was at the building making calls to the district office, the sheriff's department, and finally the bus depot. The dispatcher on duty, a man named Frank Harmon, swore he'd watched number 6 pull out that morning and hadn't heard from Rourke since. Buses didn't have GPS in 1995. If a driver didn't radio, and there was no way of knowing exactly where they were. At 7:42 p.m., the sheriff issued the first locate alert. Deputies fanned out along Highway 41 checking the route north toward the reserve. They found nothing. No stalled engine, no skid marks on the asphalt, no sign of an accident in the roadside ditches. By 9:15, parents had gathered in the high school gymnasium, the fluorescent lights painting every worried face in a sterile, unnatural glow. The sheriff spoke from the stage, his voice steady but low. "We're doing everything we can. This is still just a delay until proven otherwise. We'll keep you informed." But as the hours stretched past midnight, the word delay began to rot in the air. By dawn, the search was official. Dozens of volunteers walked the roadsides, peering down embankments and into thickets. The river was dragged. The entrance to Gray Hollow was swarmed with officers, though the park ranger swore no bus had come through that day. Reporters from the county paper arrived by afternoon, snapping photos of parents clutching old yearbook pictures and pointing to maps spread across folding tables. The image that would make the front page was of Carol Miller, her hair tangled, her hands gripping a coffee cup so tightly the foam lid had buckled inward. By the end of the second day, the search had expanded to include the neighboring counties, and state troopers' helicopters swept the valley, their rotors thundering over rooftops from above. The land looked still and harmless, a patchwork of gold and green, broken only by the thin gray threads of road. But from the ground, the forest loomed like a wall somewhere. In that wall, the parents knew their children had vanished. Whether it had been by accident or by something far darker, no one could yet say. By the third morning, the optimism had burned away. The gymnasium that had been buzzing with hurried plans now hummed with a kind of quiet that felt heavier than noise. The coffee urns stood cold on the folding tables. The school principal no longer smoothed his tie. When speaking, he simply kept his eyes low, as though looking too long into anyone's face might break him. Sheriff Raines convened his core team at 5:30 a.m. Maps were spread out like fragile paper skin across the length of 3 tables, red ink marking the official route from Alder Creek Elementary to Gray Hollow Nature Reserve. The path was simple: Highway 41 north for 40 miles, turn onto County Road 9, drive 5 more miles to the reserve gate. There were no other viable turns without a driver deliberately choosing them. Yet somehow, in less than an hour of travel, bus number 6 had vanished from the map entirely. The first sweep, the initial search, had been almost ceremonial in its precision. State troopers and local deputies divided the main route into 2 mile stretches, walking them shoulder to shoulder. Every culvert was checked, every ditch scanned for fresh tire marks, every river bend dragged with weighted hooks. The forest that framed the road was thick with pine, its floor a mosaic of needles and dark soil soft enough to record the impression of a deer's hoof. But strangely, no sign of a bus departure from the asphalt. By noon, helicopters had joined the effort, circling above in slow, measured arcs from the air, the valleys and Ridges looked like folds in an endless green quilt. Search coordinators traced and retraced their flight logs, but reported nothing unusual. One pilot noted that the visibility was so clear, he could see a white pickup parked outside a farmhouse nearly 2 miles away. If the bus had been anywhere in an open clearing, they would have seen it. The timeline problem. By reconstructing interviews with the last people to see bus number 6, investigators discovered a curious detail: the vehicle had been spotted passing mile marker 29 at 7:48 a.m. by a retired postal worker heading north. The next possible sighting, a farmer named Jonah Pike, claimed he saw a yellow bus turning west onto an unmarked gravel road at around 800. The problem: that gravel road didn't appear on county maps, and when deputies checked they found nothing, just a wall of trees, unbroken and unscarred. If Jonah had misremembered, the bus would have had just 12 minutes between those sightings to vanish from an otherwise uninterrupted stretch of highway. The weight of the missing. By the end of day 3, news vans were lined up outside the sheriff's office, their satellite dishes tilted skyward like metal flowers. National headlines called it the bus without a road. Parents spoke in halting sentences into microphones, their voices wavering between pleading and disbelief. The youngest parent, Rosa Ortega, clutched Amelia's stuffed fox as she spoke, the toys formatted from her grip. Deputies began door-to-door interviews in the towns adjacent to Alder Creek. No one had seen a bus parked in a yard or abandoned on a side street. Not a single gas station had recorded a purchase from a man matching Rourke's description. The vanishing evidence: most disappearances leave crumbs. This one left none. No tire ruts diverging into the forest, no oil drips on the road, no fragments of glass or metal that might suggest an accident. Even the CB radio logs were blank at the depot. Frank Harmon swore under oath that Rourke had not called and not even to report a delay. The silence was so complete it began to feel deliberate, as though every trace of the bus had been swept away before the search even began. The emotional fracture inside the gymnasium: the families began to splinter into groups defined by their beliefs. Some clung to the idea of a navigational accident, believing their children might still be alive, stranded somewhere deep in the backcountry. Others, quieter but no less desperate, spoke of foul play, that the bus had been taken hidden, its passengers traded from one set of hands to another until they were beyond reach. The sheriff worked to keep the speculation at bay, but in a town this small, fear moves faster than fact. Parents began to look at one another differently, as though the answer might be standing somewhere in the same room. By the end of the first week, official search efforts slowed. The man-hours, the fuel, the aerial sweeps all drained budgets faster than the county could sustain. Privately, some officers began to admit what no one wanted to say out loud: it was as though the bus had driven into thin air. But in public, Sheriff Raines repeated the same refrain: we search until we find them. It was a promise he could not know would stretch across 30 years. When the last of the volunteer search parties were called in from the forest, Alder Creek changed. It didn't happen overnight. Grief is slower, quieter than that. But within weeks, the town's rhythm was offbeat. Where there had once been the gentle rise and fall of ordinary days, there was now a steady undercurrent of absence. The Miller house, Carol Miller's kitchen, had always been the warmest in the neighborhood. She used to bake bread every Thursday, filling the house with the smell of yeast and rosemary. Her son Jack would come home from school, dropping his backpack on the floor with the same loud thud every time, and swipe the first slice while it was still steaming. After the bus vanished, the kitchen cooled, the loaves stopped coming out of the oven, neighbors dropped off casseroles and soups in covered glass dishes, but most went untouched. Carol started sleeping on the couch, as though staying in the living room would make it easier to hear him if he came home in the middle of the night. The framed school portrait of Jack, taken just a month before he disappeared, remained on the mantel, but the glass was cracked, a fault line that ran across his smile like a shadow. The Ortega apartment. Rosa Ortega's grief was noisier. Her daughter Amelia had been the youngest on the trip, and Rosa spoke about her in the present tense for months afterward, as though the act of shifting to past tense would seal a kind of verdict she wasn't ready to face. She carried Amelia's stuffed fox everywhere it was there, when she met with police, when she answered questions for reporters, when she walked the aisles of the grocery store and couldn't remember what she'd come in for. The apartment itself became a kind of shrine. Amelia's drawings, bright smears of crayon forests, and uneven rainbows were still taped to the fridge. Her shoes still sat by the door, the laces knotted in a way only a child could have tied them on the night of the first heavy rain after the disappearance. Rosa said she dreamed Amelia was standing Outside her bedroom window, her clothes dry despite the downpour, her lips moving, but making no sound. She woke to find the stuffed fox in her arms. The Huang farm, the Huang family's pain, was quieter, still an unspoken language of glances and half-finished sentences. Their son David had been quiet himself, a boy more comfortable with books than ball games, had been excited for the trip, scribbling notes about the kinds of trees they might see, folding them into his jacket pocket. Afterward, his father threw himself into farm work, plowing and sowing until the lines on his hands deepened like carved wood. His mother stayed inside, spending long afternoons at the kitchen table with the radio turned low, listening for news that never came. The family portrait on the wall was slowly overtaken by dust, not because they forgot, but because to clean it felt too much like touching around the empty desks at Alder Creek Elementary. The classrooms shifted too. 9 desks sat empty for weeks, their chairs tucked neatly in as if waiting. Teachers avoided the spaces when they could, but every so often a student would glance over, as if expecting to see a friend return. The principal had considered removing the desks altogether, but the parents objected. It was one of the few decisions the fractured group could agree on until the children were found their places in the classroom would remain. The town's split heart time did not soften the edges evenly. Some families clung to each other more tightly, meeting weekly in living rooms to trade scraps of information and rumors. Others withdrew completely, their grief turning into a private fortress that no one else was allowed to enter. Church attendance rose, but so did calls to the sheriff's office about strange cars and unfamiliar men in the area. It was as if the disappearance had taught Alder Creek that safety was an illusion, and illusions once shattered are not easily rebuilt. In the quiet hours, the town's grief took on a strange shape. It wasn't just about the 9 children anymore. It was about the road that no one could find, the driver who left without a trace, and the growing suspicion that some truths would remain locked away no matter how much the living demanded answers. Grief has a way of turning outward when there's no place for it to settle. By the second month after the disappearance, Alder Creek had gone from quiet mourning to restless murmuring in the grocery store aisles, at the diner counters, on the church steps. After Sunday service, the talk had shifted no longer just how could this have happened, but who could have made it happen. The cult theory. The first whispers came from the outskirts of town. An older couple, the Stricklands, claimed they'd heard chanting in the woods the night before the bus trip. They said it came from somewhere near the old quarry road, a place no one had reason to go anymore. When pressed, they admitted they hadn't actually seen anyone, just the sound, low and rhythmic, carrying through the trees. Within days, the story grew legs. Some said the chanting was part of a ritual, others that it was a coded signal for something darker. A group that had been waiting for the bus, a former deputy, mentioned an abandoned hunting lodge deep in the reserve, a place once rumored to host gatherings that were not entirely legal. The sheriff dismissed it publicly as folklore in real time, but behind closed doors, even he admitted the timing was strange. Still, there was no physical evidence, just the weight of possibility. The rogue driver. Then came the theory that put Daniel Rourke at the center. Some residents remembered that Rourke had been through a divorce in the early 90s, and there had been whispers even then that had started drinking more heavily. One man claimed had seen Rourke at the Rusty Nail Bar just weeks before the trip, arguing with another patron about getting out of this place for good. This theory painted him as a man who saw the bus trip as an escape that had taken the children somewhere remote, either with help or under some misguided plan to start over. The flaw in this theory was cruel and simple. How could a man disappear with 9 children and leave no trace, and why would someone who knew the land so well vanish along a route had driven hundreds of times without incident? The government angle in the back booths of the diner. A different kind of theory brewed. It began with the knowledge that Gray Hollow Nature Reserve had once been the site of a government communication station during the Cold War. The facility had been dismantled, but locals remembered trucks coming and going long after it was officially closed. From there, the story warped into something stranger. What if the bus had stumbled onto something it shouldn't have? An operation still quietly running under the guise of wilderness. One man swore his cousin's friend had seen military vehicles on an unmarked forest road a year earlier. Another claimed the government had sealed the area long before the official search began, using the missing bus as a cover for something they needed to hide. Of all the theories, this one carried the most heat, not because it was likely, but because it made people feel there was a larger, more powerful hand at play. And powerful hands are harder to fight the road that shouldn't exist. The most unsettling whispers came from those who swore they'd seen the bus turn off the main highway that morning onto a road that wasn't there. Farmer Jonah Pike's statement had been officially dismissed after the first week, but others began to echo him. A hunter named Sam Heller claimed that in the fall of '92, Head walked a logging trail deep into the northern section of the forest and found a gravel road that didn't match the maps. Head followed it for maybe a mile before it narrowed and seemed to vanish into trees. When he came back a week later, it was gone entirely, as if it had been swallowed by the forest. In the retellings, this phantom road became more than just a physical place. It became a kind of presence, appearing only to those it wanted, leading them somewhere they couldn't come back from. By Christmas of that year, kids dared each other to walk the county highways at night, whispering that if you listened closely you could hear the hum of a school bus engine somewhere just beyond the tree line. The damage done theories became currency in Alder Creek. They were traded in fragments stitched together with personal memory and overheard gossip, and carried like secret weapons to be unsheathed at the right moment. Families who had once grieved together began to splinter further. Carol Miller refused to entertain the cult theory, calling it insulting nonsense. Rosa Ortega despised the rogue driver angle fiercely, defending Rourke's character because Amelia had liked him and because the alternative felt too much like betrayal. At the Huang farm, theories were simply not discussed at all. When reporters came to the door, David's father would point them toward the main road. Without saying a word, the silent Sheriff Raines tried to keep the rumors contained. He issued careful statements to the press, avoiding language that might feed speculation. But as the first anniversary of the disappearance approached, even he admitted in a late-night interview that there were details we cannot account for. When asked about the unmarked road sightings, he only said forests change faster than people realize. What you think you saw might not be there the next day. It was meant to be a dismissal, but to the people of Alder Creek it sounded almost like confirmation. By the end of that year, the case had left the hands of official channels and settled into the realm of legend. Theories were no longer about finding the truth, they were about surviving the not knowing. And in the dark corners of the town's mind, the image lingered: a yellow bus number 6 turning slowly onto a road that no longer exists. Time didn't heal Alder Creek. It didn't solve the mystery, didn't bring the children home, didn't turn the loss into something gentler. What it did was wear it down, smooth its sharp edges until the story fit neatly into the town's landscape, like a scar hidden under clothing. Year 5, by the 5th anniversary, the searches had stopped entirely. The yellowed missing posters, once taped to telephone poles and pinned to corkboards in the post office, had curled at the edges and fallen away. The gymnasium where families had gathered in those frantic early days was now used for pancake breakfasts and holiday bazaars. The first 5 years were the hardest for the parents, not because their grief lessened, but because the rest of the towns had neighbors who had once called weekly now passed with polite nods in the grocery store. The tragedy had shifted from right now to back. Then year 10, by the 10th anniversary, the story belonged as much to the children as it did to the parents. Kids born after 1995 had grown up hearing only fragments. The bus story told in whispers at sleepovers or in the hushed tones of teachers during fire drills. It became a warning, a piece of local folklore. Don't wander too far in the woods. Don't take roads you don't know. The younger generation didn't carry the ache of the loss. For them, the 9 children existed as names etched on a memorial plaque in front of the school, flanked by flowers that were replaced less and less often. Year 15 years, and some of the families moved away. The Millers left first, selling their house to a couple from Portland who didn't know the kitchen had once been the heart of a family waiting for a boy who never came home. Rosa Ortega stayed, though her apartment grew quieter and emptier each year. The Huangs turned their grief into labor, expanding the farm until there was no time left to think. By now the case file had been archived in the sheriff's storage room, a row of cardboard boxes labeled Bus 6 1995. The boxes gathered dust, their contents growing brittle with age, the thinning memory. At some point, no one could say exactly when the missing bus stopped being part of the town's present tense. It was a ghost story, now one of several that Alder Creek told about itself, like the flood of '72, like the miner Hood vanished in the canyon. People Hood lived here long enough could still name at least one of the missing children, but the details blurred. Was it 9 who went missing, or 10? Was the driver ever found? Wasn't there something about a road in the forest that what the story slipped in and out of memory like smoke? Year 25, by the 25th anniversary, Even the local paper had stopped marking the date. The bus was now a relic of whispers brought up only when out-of-towners asked why the reserve had no direct road in from the south, or when a teacher decided to frighten their class with true local history. Eleanor March, the elderly woman who had once collapsed at the sight of the bus on TV, was now in a nursing home. She spoke less, but when she did, she sometimes asked the nurses if the children were still out there in the woods. Most assumed she was confused. The past and present folding in on each other. The sleep of a town life moved on. New businesses opened, old ones closed. Children were born, graduated, and left for cities. The forest, patient and unhurried, continued its quiet work of swallowing old trails and smoothing over scars. The place where the Phantom Road was once said to be was now a dense thicket of birch and undergrowth. Alder Creek no longer expected answers. The bus had vanished. The children were gone. The mystery had settled into the soil, and the soil had learned to keep its secrets. It began with the wind. For most of July 2025, Alder Creek had been living under an amber sky, its sunlight dimmed to the color of old paper. Wildfires had been tearing through the northern counties for weeks, and though the flames had stayed miles away, the smoke had become part of daily life, seeping under doors, collecting in the folds of curtains, making the world smell faintly of something ending. Then, on August 2nd, the wind turned south. By morning, the fire was no longer a distant rumor on the horizon. It roared down the ridges like a living thing, gorging itself on dry pine and cedar, throwing up clouds so thick the sun disappeared. Evacuation alerts lit up phones. The forest, which had been a wall of green for generations, was now a wall of flame. The burn path. In the days that followed, fire crews worked the perimeter, scraping lines into the soil, drowning hotspots in foam. It was during one of these sweeps, just beyond mile marker 47 on the old interstate, that the team from Engine 4 found the thing that shouldn't have been there. A pocket of the forest burned to its roots had revealed something half buried under years of growth, a dirt track, narrow and pale against the blackened earth. It cut into the woods at an angle no one recognized. There was no signage, no guardrail, just the skeletal remains of saplings along its edges, burned down to brittle ash. Captain Doyle, who had been fighting fires for 20 years, sent 2 crewmen to follow it. In it twisted once, twice, then ended abruptly in a clearing there. Hunched like a rusting animal was the bus. The first look, its paint had long since dulled to a mottled yellow-brown, the number 6 barely visible above the windshield frame. The windows were clouded with grime, each one holding the forest's reflection like an old warped mirror. The tires were sunken into the soil, half swallowed by decades of rot and leaf litter. The strangest thing was the way the bus sat in the clearing, not crashed, not abandoned mid-journey, but parked aligned perfectly, front wheels straight, as though the driver had intended to return. Doyle called it in. By the time investigators arrived, the clearing was ringed with smoke-hazed sunlight, and the air was unnaturally still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, frozen in time. The first officer to step inside later said it felt like walking into a room that didn't know the rest of the world had kept going. The seats were still bolted in neat rows. The fabric was torn and frayed, but the layout was intact. On 9 of the seats, neatly folded coats rested in place, each one a different size, each one the kind of bright patterned fabric you only see on children's winter wear from the mid-90s. There were no bones, no signs of violence, only dust, thick, undisturbed, and the faint smell of mildew beneath the lingering tang of smoke. In the aisle, a Polaroid camera lay on its side. The casing was cracked, but the film compartment was still closed. On the dashboard sat a driver's cap, its brim curled from age, and in the very back seat, tucked between the cushions, a folded piece of paper in a child's handwriting. Were not lost. The road that shouldn't exist. When the fire crews checked their GPS maps, the track leading to the clearing wasn't there. Neither was it on county survey records, logging maps, or satellite imagery. Older forestry maps from the 80s showed a faint dotted line in the area, but it ended 2 miles short of where the bus now sat. Deputies walked the length of it twice, marking its curves with orange tape. It was barely wide enough for the bus to have fit, and yet there were no clear entry or exit points on either end, just dense forest closing in. The call that broke the quiet news of the bus discovery reached Alder Creek before sunset. By nightfall, the town's phones were lit, with messages, group chats exploding with a mix of disbelief and dread. At the nursing home, an aide switched on the local news for the residents. When the first images of the clearing appeared on screen, Eleanor March's hand trembled on the armrest. Her eyes narrowed, focusing not on the bus itself, But on the pale, burned road leading to it, they found them. She whispered the same words she had spoken 30 years earlier, when she thought she'd seen this moment coming. The return of the past. By morning, the clearing was a fortress of police tape and floodlights. Investigators in protective suits moved between the bus and a growing field lab. Evidence bags were carried out one by one. The coats, the Polaroid camera, the drivers. Cap. The note for Alder Creek. The decades of forgetting were gone. In an instant, the case was no longer folklore. It was standing in the middle of the forest, smelling faintly of rust and smoke, and asking without words what had happened to the 9 children. The first thing they noticed was the silence, not the ordinary quiet of a forest after fire, not the distant hum of chainsaws or the whisper of wind through blackened branches, but a deeper kind of absence inside the clearing. It was as though the sound itself had stopped at the tree line and refused to follow. The bus door hung half open, its metal warped and pitted with rust. The faded stop sign on its side was frozen mid-swing, the white letters dulled to the color of old bone. Crossing the threshold, Detective Marla Keene was the first to step inside. Her boots made a brittle crunch on the floor. Layers of dead leaves and pine needles had blown in through the cracked windows, forming a carpet that muffled her steps. The air was stale and cool, smelling of rust, mildew, and something faintly sweet, a scent she couldn't place at first, though it made the back of her neck prickle. Sunlight came in thin, fractured bands through the grime-coated glass, illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like suspended ash. For a moment, she could almost believe the bus had been sealed off from time, its interior frozen exactly as it was the day it disappeared. The coats, there were 9 seats in the middle rows, where neatly folded coats rested on the cracked vinyl cushions. Each one was different: a puffy teal parka with a missing button, a red windbreaker with fraying cuffs, a yellow raincoat whose zipper was stuck halfway. All were the right sizes for children between 9 and 11 years old. They looked freshly folded, the creases sharp, the fabric clean, untouched by the dust that coated everything else. Keene didn't touch them. She didn't have to. She already knew from the old case files that these coats matched exactly the descriptions given by the parents in 1995. The objects left behind further up the aisle, a Polaroid camera lay on its side, half buried in leaf litter. The casing was cracked, the white plastic yellowed with age, but the compartment for film was still sealed shut. Evidence techs would later confirm there were still undeveloped photos inside. On the dashboard sat a driver's cap, its brim curled upward like it had been left in the sun for too long. Beside it, the ignition key still hung in place, but when they tried to turn it, the metal wouldn't budge, as though the mechanism had fused with time itself. A lunchbox lay under the 4th row of seats, its metal surface dented, but the cartoon astronaut on the front was still visible through a layer of dust. Inside were the crumbling remains of a sandwich wrapped neatly in wax paper. The note, it was in the very back seat that Keene found it, a single sheet of paper folded into a tight square wedged between the seat cushion and the wall. She eased it out carefully, feeling the fragile texture of it threaten to tear. The handwriting was uneven, the kind of large rounded script that belongs to a child still learning to control the pen. It read, "We're not lost." No name, no date, no sign of who had written it, or when the paper was dry, its creases sharp as though it had been placed there yesterday, not 30 years ago. The driver's absence. The driver's seat was empty, no bag, no thermos, no logbook, just the indentation in the cracked vinyl where someone had once sat for hours at a time. Keene glanced at the mirror above the seat, the one that allowed a driver to see the length of the bus. Its glass was cloudy, but in the reflection the 9 coats seemed to sit higher in their seats, as though the air beneath them was heavier than the rest of the bus. She turned around quickly, but of course there was nothing there, just coats, just empty seats. The sound halfway through photographing the interior, one of the evidence techs froze. "Do you hear that?" he asked. At first no one else did. Then Keene caught it, a faint irregular sound beneath the rustle of the trees outside. It wasn't wind, it wasn't the creak of the bus settling, it was high-pitched, fragmented, like children laughing somewhere very far away. The sound faded before anyone could pinpoint it. They wrote it off as the wind carrying noise from the fire crews still working the ridge, frozen in the wrong season. As they cataloged the scene, one detail stood out inside the bus: the layer of leaf litter and pine needles didn't match the current season. The needles were green and soft, as though they had fallen only recently, despite the fact that the surrounding forest had been scorched down to bare black trunks. It was as if the bus existed in its own cycle of time. The closing Dorkeen was the last to leave. She stepped down the narrow metal stairs, her hand on the rusted rail, her boots crunching onto the ashy soil of the clearing. Behind her, the bus door creaked slowly, deliberately. It swung shut. There was no wind. The investigation began with a question so simple it should have been answered in an afternoon. How did bus number 6 end up here? It was the same question Sheriff Raines had asked 30 years earlier, standing in front of a wall map, with red pins and empty coffee cups back. Then the bus was nowhere. Now it was here, but in a place that still didn't make sense. The reconstruction, the first step, was to retrace the route Detective Marla Keene and her team marked the original path from Alder Creek Elementary to Gray Hollow Nature Reserve on both modern and archival maps. They overlaid witness statements from 1995, the postal worker at mile marker 29, the farmer Jonah Pike, who claimed to have seen the bus turn onto a gravel road at 8 o'clock a.m. The problem wasn't just that Pike's gravel road no longer existed, it was that the fire had revealed a different road, entirely one that curved away from the highway more than 5 miles north of where Pike's sighting had placed it for the bus to have reached. The clearing, it would have had to leave the main highway between 748 and 7:55 a.m., travel down this now-revealed track and vanish from every set of eyes in Alder Creek for the next 30 years. The impossible hiding place. From the first sweep of the site, forensic analysts could tell the bus had been parked deliberately. Its wheels were aligned, the emergency brake engaged, the doors closed from the outside. The soil beneath the tires had compressed into deep grooves, the kind that take decades to form, as if the weight of the bus had pressed them down season after season, year after year. And yet there were no signs of human activity around it, no old campfire pits, no discarded tools or food wrappers, no footprints in the compressed dirt of the clearing. It was as if the bus had arrived, been set in place, and then the world had stepped around it. The missing 10 hours, the strangest detail, came from examining the vehicle itself. Lab results on the dust, plant matter, and weathering patterns suggested that the bus had been hidden almost immediately after it vanished. An analysis of the tire where matched records from the depot in 1995, the same tread depth, the same pattern of wear on the outer edge of the right rear tire. There was no evidence that the bus had been driven any significant distance after leaving the highway. According to this evidence, the children and the driver must have still been inside for several hours after the vehicle stopped, but by the time the search was underway later that afternoon, the bus was already concealed behind a wall of trees that had been standing for decades. In other words, the hiding place was older than the day it was used. Witnesses in 2025, the fire had brought more than just the bus into the open. It had shaken loose old memories, or perhaps old fears. 2 residents who lived along the ridge nearest the clearing came forward with unsettling accounts from the night before the bus was found. The first, a retired park ranger named Alistair Grant, said had been watching the fire line from his porch when he heard what he described as children's laughter, but far off and moving through the trees. At first he thought it was the wind carrying voices from the fire crews, but then it passed directly behind his house, a steady rhythmic sound like a group singing without words. The second was a volunteer firefighter, a woman named Cassidy Lowe. She had been part of the overnight watch and swore she'd seen light in the trees beyond the firebreak, not the flicker of flames, but the pale, steady glow of something electrical. It moved slowly, then winked out completely. Just minutes before dawn, the Phantom Road Keene ordered aerial drone footage of the newly revealed track to be compared with satellite imagery from the past 20 years. In every frame, the road was absent. Even when the foliage thinned during winter, there was no break in the canopy where the track should have been, and yet now, standing in the clearing, the road looked as old as any in the county. Its edges were lined with the blackened stumps of saplings, each one wide enough in girth to have been growing for 25 years or more. It was impossible for the bus to have entered the clearing in 1995. The road had to exist, but for 30 years it had not. The weight of the note in the evidence room, the note recovered from the backseat, sat sealed in a transparent sleeve. Forensic analysis confirmed the ink composition was from the mid-90s, but the paper itself was in inexplicably good condition, not brittle, not discolored. The handwriting analysts could only say that it was likely written by a child between the ages of 9 and 11. They could not say when, and the content were not lost was less a reassurance than a riddle, a case without gravity. By the end of the second week, the investigation had hit a wall. Every detail contradicted another. The physical evidence said the bus had been hidden immediately, yet there was no road to hide it. Witnesses in 1995 saw it turn onto a road that didn't exist, and witnesses in 2025 heard voices in a forest emptied by fire. It was as though the case had no gravity, facts didn't fall where they floated unanchored, pulling the investigators into a space where time didn't behave the way it was supposed to. For 30 years, Daniel Rourke had been a ghost, a name in a police file, a face in a faded yearbook photo, and the quiet, unanswered question that lived in every theory about the disappearance. He was the only adult on the bus that morning. If anyone knew what had happened to those 9 children, it was him. But in all the years since no body had been found, no trace of him had ever surfaced, not even a rumor worth chasing, until now. The cabin in the woods. The discovery came not from the bus itself, but from a separate sweep of the burned forest 3 miles west of the clearing. A search team stumbled across the charred skeleton of an old hunting cabin. Most of it had collapsed in the fire, but one interior wall still stood, its wooden frame scorched, but intact. On the brass doorknob, a forensic tech spotted a smudge that seemed out of place. It wasn't soot, it was oily, as though someone had touched it not long before the fire. They took a print. When it came back from the lab, the match hit like a jolt. Daniel Rourke. The timeline problem. The print wasn't old. Latent fingerprint analysis suggested it had been deposited no earlier than 2006, 11 years after the disappearance, 15 before the fire. The idea that Rourke had been alive all that time sent the case into chaos. Where had he been? Why had he never come forward? And the question everyone whispered, but no one wanted to say out loud: had the children been with him for some of those years? Keene ordered the entire cabin site sifted, but there was little to find. No personal belongings, no clothing, no papers that might connect it to the missing, just the print and a faint indentation in the floorboards where a cot might have once been. The man they thought they knew, Rourke, had been a quiet, steady figure in Alder Creek before 1995. Divorced. Yes, not especially social, but reliable, the kind of man you trusted with your kids on a school trip. Former students remembered him as the driver who kept butterscotch candies in the glove box, who honked twice when he drove past a friend's house. But the rogue driver theory, long dismissed by some as cruel, began to creep back into the conversation. If Head lived past 2006, had he been hiding, or had someone been hiding him? The vanishing trail. Keene dug into any possible sightings of Rourke over the years, but the trail was threadbare. A few false leads from other states, one blurry photo from a truck stop in Idaho in 2004. A man in a baseball cap whose posture, if you squinted, looked a little like his. No hard proof. It was as if Rourke had learned how to move without leaving a mark. Theories turn again. Theories began mutating overnight. Some argued that Rourke had taken the children somewhere only to lose them, or worse, leave them, and then drifted through the years under assumed names. Others insisted the print was planted, a deliberate misdirection to pull investigators away from whatever had really happened in that clearing. Rosa Ortega, when told about the fingerprint, shook her head until her hair fell into her face. No, she said, he wouldn't have left them if he was alive. He would have brought her home. The missing story. The hardest truth for Keene to face was that the fingerprint didn't tell a story. It was a fragment, a single heartbeat ripped out of a life. She still couldn't see. It didn't say where Rourke had gone after 2006. It didn't say if he had been alone. It didn't say if he was alive now. What it did was make the bus feel even stranger, because if Rourke had lived beyond that day in 1995, then the neat rows of coats, the untouched lunchbox, and the note were not lost, were not relics of his final moments. They were something else entirely. It was the evidence techs going through the debris sweep of the bus who found it, a high-8 camcorder wedged beneath the driver's seat, its strap tangled in the rusted metal frame. The casing was cracked, and the lens was spiderwebbed with fractures, but the tape compartment was still sealed. The camera itself was worthless, but the tape inside, that was something else. Restoration back at the lab, the technicians handled it like glass. High-8 film wasn't built to survive decades in the damp, let alone years in an unsealed vehicle. The casing had warped, the tape spools brittle and prone to snapping. It took 3 days to coax it into a playback machine, another day to clean the corrosion from the heads. The first attempt at running it produced nothing but static and warped shadows. But on the 4th day, a picture began to form. The first frames. The footage opened with the jostling view of the bus interior shot from a low angle, a child holding the camera. The grain was heavy, the colors faded into a palette of grays and pale yellows. 9 children sat in their seats, most looking out the windows, some laughing at private jokes. The voices were tinny, as though they were coming from the far end of a tunnel through the windshield. The road stretched ahead, narrow, lined with thick pine. This wasn't the open highway. It wasn't any road that still existed on a map. The change in mood 2 minutes and something shifts. One of the children, a boy in a red windbreaker, turns his head toward the right-hand windows and stares out for a long moment. Another child notices, leans over to look, and then sits back with an expression the camera can't quite catch. One by one, the chatter fades. They're all looking at something beyond the glass. The only sound now is the low hum of the engine, the unheard sound on the restored audio. There's a faint noise, not the wind, not the engine. It's high and distant, like a chorus of voices singing on a single sustained note. The pitch wavers in and out of human hearing, causing the audio meters to spike in irregular patterns. No one in the footage speaks. They just watch. Even Rourke, visible in the driver's mirror, seems to be listening. The turn, the camera shifts abruptly, tilting toward the aisle as the bus leans into a turn through the side windows. The trees seem to close in thick, tall, impossibly dense. The road is barely visible now, and yet the bus moves as if guided. In the mirror above the driver's seat, Rourke's eyes flick upward, meeting the reflection of whoever is holding the camera. It's a split second, but there's something in his look, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a moment that can't be undone. The jerk, the picture jolts. The bus stops abruptly, the children shifting in their seats. No one cries out, no one asks what's wrong. The camera wobbles to focus on the front door, where pale light seeps in from outside. It isn't daylight. It's dimmer, more like the glow of the moon on snow. The door folds open, the closing. The camera angle dips, pointed toward the floor, as if the holder is lowering it to their lap. There's movement in the aisle, a shadow passing across the light from the open door. No clear figure, just the outline of something taller than the driver and narrower, as though the space it takes up isn't quite the same shape as a person. The shadow pauses at the first row of seats, and then slowly the door swings shut from the outside. The last frame, the next cut, is abrupt. The bus door is closed. Through the windshield there's nothing. No road, no light, just the dense black of trees pressed close against the glass. The camera tilts toward the aisle one last time, catching a glimpse of the folded coats, now resting neatly on each seat. Not a single child is visible. The tape ends in static. The silence after, when the playback stopped, the lab was so quiet that Keene could hear the hum of the monitor. The techs sat back in their chairs, none of them speaking. They had no way of knowing if the tape showed the final moments on the bus, or if there had been more, if whatever happened next was never recorded, or if that footage had been lost forever. What they did know was that for the first time in 30 years, the case had a set of eyes inside the bus, and those eyes had watched something that no one could explain. The bus was moved from the clearing under the cover of night. Flatbed trucks rolled down the pale dirt track, escorted by police cruisers, whose headlights cut thin lines through the ash. The work lights made the forest look like a stage set, all shadows and hollow silhouettes. The real world sitting somewhere just beyond the tree line. Even now, with the bus in evidence storage, the clearing feels wrong. The soil still carries the outline of where its tires sank into the earth. The road, the one that shouldn't exist, is already starting to fade under the weight of fallen branches and soot. Give it a year, and it will vanish again. The parents return. When word spread that the bus had been found, the surviving parents came quietly to the site. Most didn't step past the tape. They just stood at the perimeter, eyes fixed on the empty space where the yellow shell had been. Carol Miller kept her hands folded tightly in front of her, her knuckles white. Rosa Ortega brought the stuffed fox again, setting it down on the scorched earth. Without a word, the Huangs stood together, saying nothing, the way people do when language has long since failed them. No one asked for closure. They'd lived long enough to know that closure is just another word for pretending. The investigation winds down. The official report will be clinical, a timeline, a list of recovered items, a summary of the footage that dances around what it really showed. Theories will be listed as unsubstantiated. The road will be marked as subject to further survey, but in the quiet spaces between the paragraphs, there will still be the same unanswered questions. How did the bus get there? Where did the children go? What happened to Daniel Rourke? And now added to those, a new one: who or what closed that door? The town's second silence after the initial shock fades. Alder Creek does what it always does. It folds the story back into itself. The diner will get new owners. The school will renovate its playground. The memorial plaque will be polished for the first time in years. The bus will become a story told in 2 acts: the disappearance in 1995 and the fire in 2025. Some will tell it like a mystery, some will tell it like a warning, most will tell it in a way that keeps the fear manageable. The things left out: the official record won't mention the sound of children's laughter heard in the burned forest the night before the bus was found. It won't mention the green pine Needles inside the bus despite the fire-blackened forest outside, it won't mention. The pale light that came through the door in the last minutes of the tape. And it certainly won't mention the note "We're not lost," which now sits in an evidence locker, its creases as sharp as the day. It was written, "The forest remains the forest," has always been a place of shifting boundaries, roads that appear and vanish, trails that double back on themselves, clearings that seem larger or smaller, depending on the season. It doesn't care about maps, it doesn't care about search grids or theories. It holds what it wants, and when it chooses to give something back, it is never the whole thing. The fire took thousands of acres. It gave back one bus. That was the trade. No one will ever know if it was a good one. The final image, the last image of the documentary, holds for a long time. The clearing is empty now, just a pale scar in the earth surrounded by the blackened skeletons of trees. The wind moves ash across the ground in slow spirals, and then for only a heartbeat, there's something in the corner of the frame, a flicker of yellow like paint catching the light just beyond the first line of trees. It's gone before the viewer can be sure it was there at all. The narrator's voice is low, almost a whisper. Some truths burn away, others hide deeper than we can reach, and some never wanted to be found. The screen fades to black.